Number 1. Erin Patterson, the mushroom murderer. There are people in this world who appear, on the surface, to be completely ordinary. They live in quiet neighborhoods, raise their children, attend church on Sundays, and smile warmly at everyone around them, and Erin Patterson was exactly that kind of person. A 50-year-old mother of 2 living in the small rural town of Leongatha in the state of Victoria, Australia, a place known for its rolling green farmland and peaceful community atmosphere rather than anything resembling darkness or tragedy, and she had been married to a man named Simon Patterson. And though the two had separated and were living apart by 2023, Erin had worked hard to maintain a relationship with his family, particularly his parents Donald and Gail Patterson, and Gail's sister Heather Wilkinson, and Heather's husband Ian Wilkinson, people who had known Erin for years, who had watched her children grow, who had sat beside her at church services, and who had accepted her warmth and presence as entirely genuine, and that trust, quietly and carefully cultivated over many years, would become the very thing Erin Patterson ultimately used against them. In July of 2023, Erin extended an invitation to Simon and his family for a lunch gathering at her home, telling them she had received a cancer diagnosis and wanted to break the difficult news to her children in a supportive family environment. And it was the kind of reason no one questions, because concern for a loved one's health is something every family understands instinctively, yet Simon Patterson withdrew from the invitation the night before the lunch, telling Erin he did not feel comfortable attending, and he would later tell investigators that in the 2 years leading up to that day, he had come to believe Erin had previously attempted to tamper with food and drink he had consumed on more than one occasion, and his decision not to attend that afternoon may well have saved his life, while his parents Donald and Gail Patterson, both aged 70, along with Gail's sister Heather Wilkinson aged 66, and Heather's husband Ian Wilkinson aged 68, arrived at Erin's home on July 31, 2023, Saturday down together, said a prayer and began eating the meal she had prepared. A traditional beef Wellington dish, something hearty and home-cooked, the kind of food that speaks of care and effort and hospitality. Within hours of leaving that table, all 4 guests began experiencing severe illness and were rushed to hospital with what appeared to be extreme gastrointestinal distress. And as their conditions deteriorated with alarming speed, doctors ran urgent tests to understand what was happening inside their bodies, and the answer that emerged shocked even experienced medical professionals, because all 4 guests had consumed a significant quantity of Amanita phalloides, more commonly known as the death cap mushroom, the most toxic mushroom species known to exist, and death cap poisoning operates in a particularly deceptive way in the human body because the initial symptoms may seem manageable while the toxin silently and progressively destroys liver and kidney function. And by the time the full severity of the poisoning becomes apparent, it is often too late for effective medical intervention, and Donald Patterson, Gail Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson all died in hospital from multiple organ failure, while Ian Wilkinson survived after spending weeks in intensive medical care, though his health sustained lasting damage that remained with him long after he was discharged. Investigators turned their attention to Erin Patterson almost immediately, and she told police she had no idea how dangerous mushrooms could have entered the beef Wellington, suggesting she may have accidentally included foraged mushrooms she did not recognize as harmful. But as detectives investigated further, they found this explanation could not be reconciled with the evidence, because Erin had purchased a food dehydrator and later disposed of it in a way that raised serious questions. And she had lied to police about whether she owned such a device at all, and she offered multiple contradictory versions of events throughout the investigation, and crucially, the surviving guest Ian Wilkinson testified at trial that he had observed Erin eating from a differently colored plate than those served to her 4 guests, evidence that the judge overseeing sentencing later interpreted as a deliberate precaution Erin had taken to avoid consuming the poisoned food herself. And Erin Patterson was arrested in November 2023 and charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The trial ran for approximately 9 weeks in the Supreme Court of Victoria and captured the attention of the entire nation of Australia, with more than 50 witnesses taking the stand, including Simon Patterson himself, who described in painful detail his belief that Erin had previously tampered with things he had consumed, and Erin testified in her own defense, maintaining throughout that the poisoning had been a tragic accident and that she had genuinely cared for her former in-laws, weeping. During portions of her testimony, while the prosecution countered her claims methodically, pointing to the patterns of deception, the disposal of evidence, the separate plates, and the undeniable fact that Erin herself showed no symptoms of poisoning despite claiming to have eaten the same food as her guests. And after 6 days of deliberations, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts on July 7, 2025, with Erin showing no visible emotion as each verdict was announced. And on September 8, 2025, Justice Christopher Beale addressed her directly before sentencing, telling her that her crimes involved an enormous betrayal of trust, that her victims had all been good to her and her children over many years, that she had robbed her own children of their beloved grandparents, and that he was satisfied she had planned the lunch with the intention of killing all 5 family members who had been invited, including her estranged husband Simon, and that the cancer diagnosis she had used as a pretext to bring them together was entirely fabricated, and Justice Beale sentenced Erin Patterson to 3 concurrent life sentences with a non-parole period of 33 years, meaning she will be 81 years old before she becomes eligible for parole consideration. And the case has since inspired multiple podcasts and documentary productions, standing as one of the most closely followed true crime cases in Australian legal history. Number 2. Nanny Doss, the giggling granny. To look at Nanny Doss was to see a cheerful, round-faced grandmother who laughed easily, kept a tidy home, and spoke warmly of romance and love. And almost no one who encountered her in the small towns of the American South during the mid-20th century would have guessed that behind that warm and disarming smile lived one of the most prolific domestic poisoners in American history, a woman whose crimes spanned nearly 3 decades and whose victims included not strangers or enemies, but the very people who shared her home and her table and, in many cases, her last name. And Nanny Doss was born Nancy Hazel in 1905 in Alabama, the daughter of a strict and domineering father who pulled her out of school at a young age to work on the family farm. And from her earliest years, Nanny found escape in romance magazines, consuming stories of ideal love and perfect partnerships with an intensity that those around her found both touching and slightly obsessive. And she married for the first time in 1921, a union that produced children but little of the romance she had read about so hungrily. And over the following decades she would marry 5 times in total, moving from one relationship to the next across states including Alabama, North Carolina, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and in each of these marriages a pattern emerged that no one recognized for what it was until it was far too late, because the men in Nanny's life had a troubling tendency to die suddenly and without clear medical explanation, and the cause was almost always listed as heart trouble or stomach ailment, and Nanny would collect whatever life insurance existed, grieve briefly and publicly, and then move on to the next chapter of her romantic life with a speed that struck some people as unusual but never as suspicious enough to investigate. The poison Nanny used with greatest consistency was arsenic, which she obtained in the form of rat poison and stirred into the foods and drinks of those around her with a casualness that investigators would later find deeply unsettling, because she described her methods not with remorse or hesitation but with the same cheerful, chatty energy she brought to everything else, and the foods she favored as vehicles included stewed prunes, which she is said to have prepared for more than one husband, and coffee, which she laced for others, and the toxin worked slowly enough that deaths appeared natural to the physicians who examined the victims. And it was not until 1954 that the pattern finally unraveled, when Nanny's 5th husband, a Tulsa, Oklahoma resident named Samuel Doss, fell seriously ill after consuming food Nanny had prepared for him, was hospitalized and appeared to recover, then returned home and died shortly afterward. And the physician who had treated Samuel during his hospitalization was troubled enough by the circumstances of his sudden death that he requested an autopsy be performed, telling Nanny that understanding the cause of death might save other lives in the future. And when the autopsy results came back, they revealed an enormous quantity of arsenic in Samuel Doss's body, far more than could be explained by any accidental exposure, and police were called, and Nanny Doss was arrested and taken in for questioning. What happened in that interrogation room became the detail that newspapers across America seized upon, and that would define Nanny Doss in the public imagination for generations, because rather than expressing fear or denial or distress, Nanny sat across from detectives and confessed to a string of poisonings spanning nearly 30 years, and she did so while laughing, giggling like a schoolgirl recounting a pleasant memory, offering colorful asides and seemingly delighting in the attention. And reporters who covered her arrest and trial dubbed her the giggling granny, and the contrast between her grandmotherly appearance and the gravity of what she was confessing to created a kind of cultural dissonance that the American public found simultaneously horrifying and transfixing, and the full scope of what Nanny admitted to, and what subsequent exhumations and toxicology tests confirmed, was staggering in its breadth, because investigators believed her victims may have included not only 4 of her 5 husbands but also her own mother, at least one of her sisters, 2 of her own children, a grandson and a nephew, with exhumations of multiple bodies confirming the presence of arsenic or rat poison in their systems, though Nannie herself insisted she had never harmed her blood relatives, a claim the physical evidence strongly contradicted. Oklahoma prosecutors made the decision to try Nannie on a single count, the murder of Samuel Doss, and after she was examined by 4 psychiatrists who all declared her mentally competent to stand trial, proceedings began in June of 1955 in the Criminal Court of Tulsa, and before the trial could fully get underway, Nannie entered a guilty plea on May 17, 1955, a decision her own attorneys acknowledged they had advised her to make, and Judge Elmer Adams sentenced her to life imprisonment, declining to impose the death penalty and later explaining that he did not wish to set what he described as a poor precedent by executing a woman, particularly one with possible mental health considerations, and Nanny Doss appeared genuinely pleased with the outcome, smiling broadly as she was led from the courtroom, and she spent the remaining years of her life in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, reportedly still reading her beloved romance magazines and speaking of her dream of finding perfect love, and she died of leukemia in the prison hospital in 1965, taking with her any full accounting of everyone whose life she had taken, and to this day her case remains one of the most studied examples of domestic serial poisoning in American criminological history, a case that forced investigators, physicians, and families across the country to reckon with the deeply uncomfortable truth that danger does not always announce itself, and that the most trusted person in a home can also be the most dangerous. Number 3. Stacy Castor, the Black Widow. Stacy Ruth Castor grew up in the small town of Weedsport in upstate New York, and by the early 2000s appeared to those around her to be a perfectly unremarkable woman living a perfectly unremarkable life. She worked as an office manager, raised 2 daughters, and had been married and widowed once before finding a new partner in a man named David Castor, and neighbors and co-workers who knew her described her as friendly, outgoing, and even likable, someone who attended neighborhood gatherings and spoke fondly of her family, and there was nothing in her daily presentation that would have caused anyone to look twice or wonder about the quiet domestic life she maintained behind closed doors. And yet beneath that surface Stacy Castor was carrying a secret that would eventually unravel in one of the most disturbing and layered poisoning cases that investigators in New York State had ever encountered, a case involving not 1 but 2 husbands, an attempt to end the life of her own daughter, and a scheme so coldly calculated that the judge who ultimately sentenced her said he had never in 34 years of working in the criminal justice system seen anything remotely comparable. Stacy's first husband was a man named Michael Wallace, and the two had married in 1988 and together had 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree, but Michael Wallace died in 2000 at a relatively young age, and his death was attributed at the time to a heart attack, and Stacy collected on his life insurance policy and moved forward with her life. And within a few years she had met David Castor, and the 2 married in 2003, and David Castor was by most accounts a decent and straightforward man who appeared genuinely happy in the relationship, but in August 2005, just 2 years into their marriage, David Castor was found unresponsive at their home in the Syracuse suburb of Clay, and when emergency services arrived the scene had been arranged to suggest that David had become despondent, consumed a large amount of alcohol and taken his own life, and investigators initially accepted this explanation, and the death was ruled a suicide. And Stacy Castor once again collected on a life insurance policy and once again became a widow, and once again the people around her accepted her grief as genuine and moved on, and the case might have remained closed forever had it not been for what happened 2 years later in a neighboring county. In 2007, investigators in Cayuga County were examining the circumstances of Michael Wallace's death with fresh eyes, and they made the decision to exhume his body and submit samples for modern toxicological testing. And what those tests revealed was that Michael Wallace had not died of a heart attack at all. His body contained ethylene glycol, the toxic chemical compound found in antifreeze, at levels consistent with deliberate poisoning. And this discovery prompted investigators to reopen the David Castor case and subject the evidence from that scene to similar scrutiny, and the results were identical. David Castor had also been poisoned with ethylene glycol, and the manner in which it had been administered pointed to deliberate and sustained effort rather than any accidental exposure, with prosecutors later presenting evidence that Stacy had used a kitchen baster to introduce the substance into David's food and drink over a period of 4 days that coincided with their wedding anniversary, after which she staged the scene at their home to support the appearance of suicide. Stacy Castor was charged in September 2007, and she maintained her innocence completely. But the investigation took an even more disturbing turn in that same month when Stacy's own daughter, Ashley Wallace, was found at the family home in a deeply serious medical condition after consuming what turned out to be a combination of prescription medications and vodka. And when investigators arrived at the scene, they found a handwritten note that appeared to be a suicide confession in which Ashley admitted to killing David Castor and expressed remorse, and Stacy Castor told authorities that Ashley had apparently written the note herself and taken her own life. And the intention behind this claim, prosecutors would argue at trial, was to redirect suspicion for David Castor's death onto Ashley and to ensure that Stacy herself would never be held accountable. And it was an act of almost incomprehensible coldness, the calculated attempt to sacrifice her own child to protect herself. And Ashley survived after receiving emergency medical treatment, and when she recovered she was adamant that she had not written the note and had no memory of the events, and toxicological analysis of what Ashley had consumed supported the conclusion that she had been sedated, and then had the toxic mixture administered to her over an extended period while she was unable to resist, with prosecutors presenting evidence suggesting Stacy had fed the substance to her unconscious daughter using a teaspoon over approximately 17 hours. The trial of Stacy Castor began in early 2009 in Onondaga County, and the jury, 10 women and 2 men, deliberated for 16 hours over 4 days before returning a verdict of guilty on both the murder of David Castor and the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and Stacy sat stone-faced as the verdicts were read, and at sentencing on March 5, 2009, Onondaga County Judge Joseph Fahey delivered remarks that were remarkable in their directness, telling Stacy that in 34 years of working in criminal justice he had seen serial killers and contract killers of every description, but that she occupied a category entirely by herself, and that he had never seen a parent willing to sacrifice her own child to evade justice, and he sentenced her to 25 years to life for the murder of David Castor, and an additional 25 years for the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, along with a further sentence for forging David's will, meaning she would need to serve a minimum of 51 years and 4 months before becoming eligible for parole, a sentence that effectively guaranteed she would die in prison. And that is precisely what happened, because Stacy Castor died on June 11, 2016 at the age of 48 at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Westchester County, New York, having never acknowledged any responsibility for what she had done. And the case remains one of the most studied examples of domestic poisoning in American true crime, not only because of the crimes themselves but because of the extraordinary coldness with which Stacy Castor turned on her own daughter in an effort to save herself. Number 4. Audrey Marie Hilley. Audrey Marie Hilley was the kind of woman who made a strong impression. She was socially ambitious, carefully presented, and keenly aware of how she was perceived by the people around her in Anniston, Alabama, where she had grown up and where she had married her high school sweetheart, Frank Hilley, in 1951, and for many years from the outside the marriage looked like any other, a working-class couple building a life together in a small southern city, raising their son Michael and later their daughter Carol, and Marie, as she preferred to be called, was known in her community as someone who rubbed elbows with the town's more prominent families and who cared deeply about her social standing. And that ambition for a better and more comfortable life than the one she actually had would prove to be the thread that connected every terrible decision she made from the mid-1970s onward, because in May of 1975, Frank Hilley began feeling unwell, visiting his doctor complaining of nausea and abdominal pain, and the doctor diagnosed what appeared to be a viral stomach ailment and sent him home. But Frank's condition did not improve and he was admitted to hospital for further testing, and the tests revealed serious liver dysfunction, and despite the efforts of his medical team, Frank Hilley died on May 25, 1975, with his official cause of death recorded as infectious hepatitis, and Marie Hilley collected on his life insurance policy. And the community of Anniston mourned alongside her, and the death was accepted as a sad but natural tragedy, and that acceptance would remain undisturbed for several years. What investigators eventually pieced together was that Frank Hilley had been given arsenic in small, consistent doses over a period of time, doses calculated to cause cumulative organ damage that would appear to a physician to be the result of illness rather than deliberate harm. And the method was patient and methodical and required a level of calculation that spoke to a mind comfortable with deception. But it was not Frank's death that first brought Marie Hilley to the attention of law enforcement. It was what she began doing to her own daughter, Carol Hilley, in the years that followed, because Carol began experiencing similar symptoms to those her father had suffered, episodes of nausea and weakness and physical deterioration that no doctor could satisfactorily explain, and Carol was hospitalized on multiple occasions, and during one of those hospitalizations a physician ordered a hair sample analysis, and the results revealed the presence of arsenic in Carol's system at levels that were entirely consistent with ongoing deliberate poisoning rather than any environmental exposure, and the investigation that followed led authorities back to Frank Hilley's death, and when his remains were exhumed and tested the presence of arsenic was confirmed there as well. And in 1979 Marie Hilley was indicted on charges of attempted murder of her daughter and murder of her husband. What makes the Hilley case extraordinary beyond even the poisonings themselves is what happened next, because Marie Hilley was arrested and released on bond while awaiting trial, and she used that freedom to disappear entirely, fleeing Alabama and making her way to Florida, then Texas, then eventually to New England, and over the following 3 years she constructed entirely new identities for herself, living first as a woman named Robbie Hannon, and eventually meeting and marrying a man named John Homan in New Hampshire who had no knowledge of her real identity or her history, and then in one of the most audacious acts of deception in the history of American fugitive cases, Marie Hilley traveled alone to Texas and fabricated her own death, creating the fiction that Robbie Hannon had died, and then she returned to John Homan and presented herself as Robbie's twin sister, a woman named Terry Martin, and John Homan, grieving the supposed death of his wife, accepted this woman into his life, reportedly not recognizing her because she had changed her appearance, and this arrangement continued until local detectives in New Hampshire began looking more carefully at the woman who called herself Terry Martin and ran her details through law enforcement databases and identified her as the wanted fugitive Audrey Marie Hilley from Alabama, and she was arrested and extradited back to face trial. The trial of Marie Hilley took place in June of 1983, and the jury deliberated for just 3 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on both the murder of Frank Hilley and the attempted murder of Carol Hilley, and the following day Judge Sam Monk sentenced her to life imprisonment for the murder and an additional 20 years for the attempted murder, and Marie entered the Julia Tutwiler State Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama, where she was classified as a medium security prisoner and assigned work as a data processor, and she consistently maintained her innocence throughout her incarceration. And then in February of 1987 she was granted a 3-day compassionate furlough, and she walked out of the prison gates and did not return. And when authorities searched for her they found her days later on a residential porch near her birthplace, exposed to the elements and heavy rain, suffering from severe hypothermia, and she was rushed to hospital but died on February 26, 1987 at the age of 53, before she could be returned to custody, and her death by hypothermia in the Alabama cold brought a close to one of the most elaborate and unsettling cases of domestic poisoning and identity deception that American law enforcement had ever encountered, a case that changed the way physicians were trained to interpret patterns of unexplained illness within the same household, and that reminded investigators everywhere that the most dangerous suspect is often the one no one has yet thought to question. Number 5. Lynn Turner, the antifreeze killer. Lynn Turner, born Julia Lynn Womack in 1968 in Marietta, Georgia, was adopted as an infant by a comfortable and well-established family in Cumming, Georgia, and by the time she reached adulthood she had developed a reputation for being attractive and socially confident, someone who moved easily among people and who had a particular fondness for the company of men who worked in law enforcement and emergency services, and she dated a succession of police officers and first responders before marrying one, a Cobb County police officer named Glenn Turner, in the early 1990s, and to the people who knew them they appeared to be a young couple building a future together. And Glenn Turner was by all accounts a dependable and decent man who had no obvious enemies and no serious health problems, and so when he fell acutely ill in early 1995, complaining of symptoms that resembled a severe flu or viral infection, and was taken to hospital but failed to recover and died on March 3, 1995. The death was attributed to natural causes, specifically a heart attack, and Lynn Turner became a widow at a relatively young age, collected on Glenn's life insurance and death benefits, and moved forward with her life, and the investigation was closed and Glenn Turner was buried, and the community grieved, and no one suspected anything other than a tragedy of the kind that occasionally and randomly strikes young families. What could not have been predicted by anyone at that time was that Lynn Turner would go on to repeat almost exactly the same sequence of events 6 years later, because after Glenn's death she had developed a relationship with a Forsyth County firefighter named Randy Thompson, and the two had 2 children together, And Randy Thompson was also by all accounts a kind and straightforward man who had no reason to fear the person closest to him, and yet in January of 2001 Randy Thompson fell seriously ill with symptoms strikingly similar to those Glenn Turner had experienced before his death: nausea, disorientation, and a rapid physical decline. And he was taken to hospital, and on January 22, 2001, Randy Thompson died, and once again the initial findings did not raise an immediate alarm, but investigators in Forsyth County began looking more carefully at the circumstances, and when toxicological testing was performed on samples from Randy Thompson's body, the results revealed the presence of ethylene glycol, the principal toxic compound in antifreeze, at levels entirely inconsistent with any accidental exposure. And this discovery prompted investigators to go back and look at Glenn Turner's case with entirely new eyes, and the exhumation of Glenn Turner's remains and subsequent toxicological analysis confirmed the same finding. Ethylene glycol was present in his body as well, and what had been attributed to a heart attack in 1995 had in fact been a deliberate poisoning carried out in the same manner and by the same hand as the one that had killed Randy Thompson 6 years later. Prosecutors argued that Lynn Turner had used antifreeze as her method of choice because ethylene glycol has a slightly sweet taste that can be masked effectively when introduced into certain foods, and that she had specifically chosen Jell-O as one of the vehicles through which she administered the substance, because the color and texture of the gelatin made it nearly impossible to detect any adulteration, and that the motive in both cases was financial: the life insurance policies and death benefits that she stood to collect from each man's death. And Lynn Turner was arrested and charged with the murder of Glenn Turner, and her first trial, which took place in 2004 in Cobb County, resulted in a verdict of guilty after the jury deliberated for a relatively brief period, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years, and she maintained her innocence completely and did not testify in her own defense. And the jury in the Glenn Turner case heard evidence connecting the two deaths and found it persuasive enough to convict without hesitation. And then a second prosecution followed, this one in Whitfield County for the murder of Randy Thompson. And this trial presented the additional and deeply painful dimension that Randy Thompson was the father of Lynn Turner's 2 children. And the proceedings began in March 2007 and lasted approximately 12 days, and the jury again found her guilty of malice murder. And in the sentencing phase, the prosecution sought the death penalty, and Randy Thompson's family attended the proceedings and expressed their belief that justice was necessary both for Randy and for the truth about how he had died. And the jury ultimately did not impose the death penalty but instead sentenced Lynn Turner to a second life sentence, this one without the possibility of parole, and she was returned to custody at Metro State Prison in Atlanta where she was serving her first sentence. And on August 30, 2010, prison officials found Lynn Turner unresponsive in her cell, and efforts to revive her were unsuccessful, and a subsequent autopsy conducted by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation concluded that she had died of a self-administered overdose of her prescription blood pressure medication, ruling her death a suicide, and she was 42 years old, and her case is studied and discussed not only because of the deliberate and repeated nature of the poisonings, but because both victims were men who dedicated their professional lives to protecting others, one a police officer and one a firefighter, and who had no protection at all from the person they trusted most inside their own home. Number 6. Diane Staudte. Springfield, Missouri is a mid-sized city in the Ozarks region, the kind of place where neighbors tend to know one another and where family life is often at the center of community identity. And in 2012, Diane Staudte appeared to be a woman living a conventional and unremarkable domestic life. She was the mother of several children, the wife of a man named Mark Staudte, and by all outward appearances a functioning and ordinary member of her community, and there was nothing in her daily presentation that would have suggested to anyone around her that she was engaged in a deliberate and methodical campaign to remove the people in her own household who she had come to regard as burdens or obstacles, and the substance she and her daughter Rachel Staudte used to carry out that campaign was antifreeze, specifically the ethylene glycol compound, which they introduced into the drinks of family members without their knowledge over a period of months. And the first to die was Mark Staudte, Diane's husband of many years, who passed away in April of 2012 after a period of unexplained illness. And his death was not immediately flagged as suspicious because the symptoms he had experienced were consistent with several natural medical conditions. And then 5 months later, in September of 2012, Diane's son Sean Staudte also died after experiencing what appeared to be a similar pattern of sudden illness. And he was 26 years old, and he was her own child, and even after 2 deaths in the same household within a matter of months, no immediate criminal investigation was launched, because each death appeared in isolation to be explicable by natural causes, and it was only when Diane's daughter Sarah Staudte was admitted to hospital in a critical condition and physicians began looking more carefully at the pattern of illness and death within this particular family that the terrible truth began to emerge. The investigation that followed led detectives to Diane Staudte and her daughter Rachel, and when confronted with the evidence that had been gathered, Diane Staudte ultimately confessed to police that she had poisoned her husband, her son, and her daughter by introducing antifreeze into their drinks, and the confession was detailed and direct, and it shocked investigators not only because of the nature of the crimes but because of the apparent absence of any emotional weight in the way she described them, and the motive that emerged from the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings was a combination of financial considerations. There were life insurance policies involved, and what investigators and prosecutors characterized as a desire to eliminate relationships and obligations she had come to find oppressive, and the involvement of her daughter Rachel in the crimes added an additional layer of tragedy to an already devastating case. Because Rachel Staudte was a young woman who had participated in the poisoning of her own father and brother at her mother's direction, and the long-term effects on Sarah Staudte, the daughter who survived, were severe and permanent. She sustained serious neurological damage as a result of the poisoning and required assisted living care following her discharge from hospital, and when Diane Staudte was later asked about Sarah in a television interview, she expressed a vague and general sorrow that stopped well short of anything resembling genuine accountability, at one point suggesting she herself had somehow also suffered, a statement that investigators and prosecutors publicly rejected as having no basis in evidence whatsoever, and Diane Staudte entered an Alford plea, a legal mechanism that acknowledges the prosecution has sufficient evidence to convict without constituting a formal admission of guilt, to 2 counts of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced in 2018 to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and Rachel Staudte pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree assault and was sentenced to 2 life terms plus an additional 20 years, and Sarah Staudte, the daughter who survived, continues to live with the permanent physical consequences of what her own mother chose to do to her, and her survival stands as both a testament to the resilience of the human body and a daily reminder of the extraordinary and intimate nature of the betrayal carried out within the walls of that Springfield home. Number 7. Kristin Rossum. Kristin Margareta Rossum was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1976, and by the time she reached her early 20s she had assembled a life that looked, from the outside, like the beginning of a genuinely promising future. She had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in chemistry from San Diego State University. She had secured a position as a toxicologist at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, which was a competitive and professionally respected role for someone her age, and she had married a young man named Gregory de Villers in 1999, and Gregory worked for an up-and-coming biotech firm and was described by people who knew him as a warm and dedicated partner, who loved his wife deeply, and who believed in the life they were building together. And the two had moved into an apartment in San Diego and by all external appearances were a young professional couple with every reason to look forward to what was ahead of them. And yet beneath that surface Kristin Rossum had developed a serious addiction to methamphetamine, a habit that had begun during her time in high school and that she had worked carefully to conceal from everyone around her including Gregory. And she had also begun a romantic relationship with her direct supervisor at the medical examiner's office, a married man named Dr. Michael Robertson, and by late 2000 Gregory de Villers had discovered both the affair and the drug use, and he confronted Kristin with what he knew and made clear that unless she ended the relationship with Robertson and stopped using methamphetamine, he intended to report everything to her employer, a disclosure that would almost certainly have cost Kristin her career and the professional standing she had worked so hard to build. And faced with that threat, Kristin Rossum made a decision that would define the rest of her life. On the evening of November 6, 2000, Kristin called emergency services and reported that her husband had lost consciousness at their home. And when paramedics arrived, they found Gregory de Villers lying unresponsive on the bed the couple shared, and scattered across his body and across the bed were red rose petals, and near him was a photograph of the couple together, and the scene appeared to have been arranged to suggest that Gregory had taken his own life in a moment of despair, and Kristin told emergency responders that Gregory had been despondent about the state of their marriage and had told her earlier that day that he had taken a combination of old prescription medications, and the manner in which the scene had been composed The rose petals, the wedding photograph, the staging, reflected a scene from a film called American Beauty, which investigators would later learn was one of Kristin Rossum's favorite movies. And authorities initially accepted the possibility that the death might be a suicide, but the autopsy told a different story, because Gregory de Villers had died from a lethal concentration of fentanyl in his system, a powerful synthetic substance that Kristin, as a toxicologist, had direct professional access to at the medical examiner's office, and further investigation revealed that a significant quantity of fentanyl had been reported missing from the lab's inventory in the period leading up to Gregory's death. And when investigators began examining the full picture, Kristin's access to the substance, the missing inventory, the affair with her supervisor, the threat Gregory had made to expose her, and the careful staging of the scene, the case for deliberate poisoning became overwhelming, and Kristin Rossum was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial that followed received extensive media coverage and was notable for the way it exposed the extraordinary position of trust that Kristin had occupied as a toxicologist. Someone whose entire professional purpose was to help determine how people had died was using that very expertise and access to conceal a murder, and Kristin testified in her own defense over the course of the 3-week trial, insisting that Gregory had taken his own life and that she was innocent, and her attorney presented the argument that the prosecution's case was circumstantial, but the jury found the weight of the evidence persuasive and on what would have been Gregory de Villers' 29th birthday. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, and Kristin Rossum appeared to buckle as the jurors left the courtroom, and she was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and she remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, continuing to appeal her conviction on various grounds, and the case endures in true crime scholarship as a study in how professional expertise and access, rather than protecting a community, was turned inward and used as a tool of harm against the one person who had trusted Kristin Rossum most completely. Number 8. Tianle Li. Tianle Li had built the kind of life that many people spend years working toward. She had emigrated from China, earned a doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, secured a position as a chemist at the prestigious pharmaceutical company Bristol Myers Squibb where she worked for a decade, and she and her husband Xiaoye Wang, a computer software engineer who had also come from China, lived in the quiet and comfortable township of Monroe in Middlesex County, New Jersey, where the couple had a young son who was just a toddler at the time the events of this case unfolded, and to neighbors on the upscale street where they lived the family appeared to be a successful and educated couple living the kind of life that reflects years of dedication and hard work, and yet those same neighbors had also noticed that police were called to the home with an unusual frequency, sometimes more than once in a single week, and that the sounds of arguments carrying through open windows were a recurring feature of life on that street, and the marriage of Tianle Li and Xiaoye Wang had been deteriorating for years, marked by domestic disputes serious enough to require law enforcement involvement on multiple occasions, and by 2010 the couple had begun formal divorce proceedings, and the finalization of the divorce was scheduled for January 14, 2011, and it was in the weeks leading up to that date that Tianle Li made a decision that would ultimately cost her husband his life and herself her freedom. The substance she used was thallium, a heavy metal that is classified as extremely toxic even in very small quantities, that is tasteless and odorless and therefore undetectable by the person consuming it, that was banned for general consumer use in the United States precisely because of how lethal it is, and that Tianle Li had access to through her work as a chemist at a major pharmaceutical company, where she ordered a quantity of the substance through professional channels in 2010. And prosecutors argued that she introduced the thallium into Xiaoye Wang's food on multiple occasions in the weeks before the divorce was to be finalized, and on January 14, 2011. The exact day their divorce was scheduled to be completed, Xiaoye Wang checked himself into Princeton Medical Center complaining of abdominal pain and numbness in his hands and feet, symptoms that the initial treating physicians attributed to a flu-like viral illness, and his condition continued to worsen over the days that followed despite treatment, and it was only when a nurse recalled having encountered a case involving thallium poisoning in China in the 1990s that the idea of heavy metal toxicity was raised as a possibility. And by the time tests confirmed that Xiaoye Wang had indeed been poisoned with thallium, it was too late to reverse the damage that had been done to his body, and he lapsed into a coma and died on January 26, 2011, at the age of 39, and he left behind a toddler son whose care became the subject of immediate concern following his father's death and his mother's arrest. Tianle Li was arrested and charged with murder and hindering prosecution, and she pleaded not guilty and maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings. And her young son was placed initially with a foster family while relatives traveled from China to care for him, and the trial lasted approximately 2 months in Middlesex County and included testimony from a fellow inmate who stated that Tianle Li had confessed to her while the two were sharing a cell during the pretrial period. Though Tianle Li and her attorney disputed the credibility of this testimony vigorously, and she would later file legal motions arguing that the testimony had been fabricated. And the jury considered all of the evidence presented and in July of 2013 returned verdicts of guilty on both the murder charge and the charge of hindering prosecution. And on September 30, 2013, Superior Court Judge Michael Toto sentenced Tianle Li to life in prison with a parole eligibility date approximately 63 years in the future, making her effectively 106 years old before she could be considered for release. And Judge Toto described the crime as planned, calculated, and committed in a cruel and depraved manner. And Tianle Li, who had remained tearful during the sentencing proceedings, read a brief statement in which she said she prayed for her husband's soul and reiterated her intention to appeal, and she continues to serve her sentence at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey, and her case is notable not only for the rare and particularly lethal nature of the poison she chose but for the way it illustrated how professional access to dangerous materials, in the wrong hands, can become something devastating that those materials were never designed or intended to be. Number 9. Amy Archer-Gilligan. Long before the phrase elder abuse entered the public consciousness or nursing home oversight became a matter of serious regulatory concern, a woman named Amy Duggan Archer-Gilligan was operating a private care home in the small town of Windsor, Connecticut, that over the course of a decade became the site of an extraordinary number of unexplained deaths, and the story of Amy Archer-Gilligan is in many ways a story about invisibility, about how a population considered elderly and infirm, often with no nearby family members, can disappear from the world without anyone asking the questions that most need to be asked. And Amy was born in 1873 in Milton, Connecticut, the 8th of 10 children, and she received a basic education and by 1901 had opened a private home for the care of elderly residents in Windsor, initially in partnership with her first husband James Archer, and the home developed a modest reputation as a place where older individuals could live with some degree of comfort and supervision, and residents paid a flat fee, sometimes a substantial one, to be housed and cared for there, and Amy cultivated an image of warmth and religiosity, earning the informal title Sister Amy among those who knew her, and on the surface the Archer home appeared to be a legitimate and even admirable enterprise at a time when very few such facilities existed. The reality that investigators would eventually uncover was something far removed from that image, because the Archer home had an extraordinarily high rate of resident deaths, with authorities ultimately counting approximately 60 deaths at the facility between 1907 and 1917, a figure so disproportionate that local obituary writers had noticed and been troubled by it years before any official investigation began, and the pattern Amy followed was methodical and financially motivated. She identified residents who had assets or insurance policies, encouraged them to name her as a beneficiary in their wills, charged steep ongoing fees for care, and then ensured that their deaths arrived more quickly than nature alone would have brought them. And she also married some of the male residents, most notably a man named Michael Gilligan in 1913, who was 57 years old and in good health when he moved into the home and who was dead within the following year, leaving Amy the beneficiary of his estate, and the official cause recorded at the time was an acute digestive complaint that physicians accepted without question. And Amy repeated variations of this pattern across multiple victims over more than a decade, purchasing arsenic from local shops in quantities she claimed were needed to address a rat problem, and it was not until 1914, when the family of a resident named Franklin Andrews began asking persistent questions about his sudden death, that the first serious scrutiny was applied to the Archer home, and Andrews was a 60-year-old man who had been performing physical labor around the property one morning and was dead by that same evening, with his death recorded as a stomach ulcer, and his sister Nellie Pierce had found correspondence suggesting Amy had been pressing her brother for money, and she refused to let the matter rest, and her persistence eventually forced the authorities to act. State police opened a formal investigation that lasted nearly a year, during which time multiple bodies were exhumed from the cemetery and submitted for toxicological analysis. And the results established that Franklin Andrews and several other former residents of the Archer home had died from arsenic or strychnine poisoning, and local shop owners testified that Amy had purchased substantial quantities of arsenic over the years, and evidence emerged that the will of her second husband, Michael Gilligan, had been written in Amy's own handwriting rather than his, and Amy Archer-Gilligan was arrested on May 8, 1916, and charged initially with 5 counts of murder, though her attorney succeeded in having the charges consolidated to a single count, the murder of Franklin Andrews, and her trial began in June of 1917 and received national attention, with the Hartford Courant running front-page headlines describing the Archer home as a possible murder factory, and the prosecution presented toxicological testimony establishing that Franklin Andrews' stomach had contained enough arsenic to end the lives of several healthy adults, and the jury found Amy Archer-Gilligan guilty, and she was sentenced to death by hanging, but her lawyers appealed and the conviction was overturned on a procedural basis, and a second trial began in June of 1919, and this time Amy changed her plea to guilty of second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment, and she was later transferred to a state psychiatric facility after her mental health deteriorated significantly, and she lived out the remainder of her life there, reportedly playing funeral marches on the piano and speaking to herself in the corridors, and she died on April 23, 1962, at the age of 88, and the institution she had run became the real-world inspiration for the celebrated dark comedy play Arsenic and Old Lace, and her case is remembered today as one of the earliest documented examples of what we now recognize as predatory elder abuse, and as a permanent reminder of how completely a position of trust and care can be corrupted when the wrong person occupies it. Number 10. Kouri Richins. Kouri Richins was 33 years old and the mother of 3 young boys when her husband Eric Richins, a 39-year-old businessman from Utah, was found dead in their bed in the early morning hours of March 4, 2022, and the image she presented to the world in the immediate aftermath of his death was one of a grieving wife and devoted mother navigating an unthinkable loss, and she cooperated with investigators and expressed her devastation publicly and continued to care for her 3 sons, and she even channeled what she described as her grief into a creative project. She wrote and self-published a children's book about loss and coping with the death of a parent, a book that she sold and promoted while the investigation into her husband's death was ongoing, and many people who encountered Kouri Richins during this period accepted her presentation at face value because the combination of visible grief, maternal devotion, and the touching act of writing a children's book about loss created an image that was difficult to reconcile with anything sinister, and yet the autopsy results told a story that had nothing to do with natural causes, because the toxicological analysis of Eric Richins' body revealed that he had died from fentanyl intoxication, and the concentration of fentanyl found in his blood was approximately 5 times what would constitute a lethal dose, meaning he had consumed an enormous quantity of the substance, far beyond any amount that could be explained by accidental recreational use, and the investigation that followed led detectives to examine the full history of Eric and Kouri's marriage, and what they found was a relationship marked by significant financial conflict, with evidence suggesting that Kouri had on at least one prior occasion attempted to give Eric a substance without his knowledge, and that the couple had been engaged in ongoing disputes about money, property, and the direction of their lives together, and that Kouri stood to benefit substantially from Eric's death through insurance proceeds and assets, and investigators built a case around the conclusion that Kouri Richins had obtained fentanyl and administered it to her husband in a quantity deliberately calculated to end his life, and she was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and other related counts, and the case attracted significant national attention in part because of the extraordinary contrast between the public image Kouri had cultivated, the grieving mother who had written a children's grief book, and the charges she now faced, and the trial took place in early 2026, in Summit County, Utah, and the jury deliberated for approximately 3 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on all counts including the charge of aggravated murder. And at the sentencing hearing on May 14, 2026, Kouri Richins addressed the court in what her defense described as an unusually lengthy statement directed at her 3 sons, telling them she loved them and had been unable to contact them since early 2024, and that she used the opportunity of the public proceeding to send them a message, and she expressed what she described as sorrow about the situation while stopping short of accepting responsibility for Eric's death. And the sentencing judge was direct and unsparing in his remarks, telling the court that a person convicted of committing what Kouri Richins had committed, in the manner she had committed it and for the reasons she had done so, was simply too dangerous ever to be free, and he sentenced Kouri Richins to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the 3 young boys whose lives were irrevocably altered by the loss of their father and the imprisonment of their mother became the true and lasting human cost of what happened inside that Utah home on the night of March 4, 2022, and the case stands as a reminder that grief, sincerely performed and genuine grief, are not the same thing, and that the most elaborate and convincing performance of innocence cannot ultimately withstand the evidence that the truth leaves behind.